Okay, well, hello, everybody. Welcome to TESOL 2250. This is week 11, day 1. And today we're going to be starting a new chapter on rearranging core sentences. So this has a lot of things in it. We're going to be in this unit for a while, probably over the next 3 weeks or so. And so you're going to see this agenda on every single one of my slides. And what we're going to be covering in those particular groups of slides is going to be in bold. So today we're going to be looking specifically at negative sentences and yes/no questions and how to diagram those in class. So when it comes to talking about negatives and questions, one key point I want you to remember for the next 3 weeks is that an auxiliary verb is required to create negatives and all questions. So always kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we go through some of these examples. Now let's look at negative sentences first. Now, negative sentences are sentences that have a not in them. So for example, if I have the sentence, my aunt is coming to the barbecue, this is what we would call a positive sentence. If I instead put not in there, my aunt is not coming to the barbecue, I have a negative sentence. So we create a negative sentence simply by inserting the word not after the first auxiliary verb in the sentence. And that's what we see here. Notice we have the auxiliary verb be, in this case is, and we just simply put not after that first auxiliary verb, and then we get a negative sentence. So here's a couple other examples. Michelle's friends have arrived. Now, if we want to say the negative version of that, I can say Michelle's friends have not arrived, and I added yet here. Michelle's friends have not arrived yet. So once again, we have auxiliary verb have, and then we just simply place not afterward, and that creates a negative sentence. Now let's take a look at the next sentence. I woke up early yesterday. Now I just want you to pause the video for a minute, and I want you to just say what the negative version of the sentence would be. So you should have, I did not wake up early yesterday. Okay, so now we had to add something here. We had to add the auxiliary verb do. And so I want to remind you of a couple of rules here, and this is going to be our negative sentence rule, which we see at the top of each of these slides. It says to create a negative sentence, insert not after the first auxiliary verb in the sentence. But what if you don't have an auxiliary verb? Well, in this case, we have to add a second rule. If you don't have an auxiliary verb, then you need to create one, and that is do. So that's exactly what we see going on in the third example here. I woke up early yesterday. Well, there's no auxiliary verb. Remember, we're looking for have, be, or any modal auxiliaries like may, can, should, etc. We don't see any of those auxiliaries there, so we always need an auxiliary verb to create a negative sentence. We have to create do. So we're going to generate do before the central verb or the core verb, in this case, which is wake up. It's a phrasal verb. And we're going to generate do there, and then we're going to add not, and that's going to give us a grammatically correct sentence. I did not wake up early yesterday. So we've already seen several auxiliary verbs, and we note that, remember that the auxiliary verb is going to take the tense away from the verb next to it, and the following verb form is going to be in some kind of non-finite form or non-tensed form. So if we have auxiliary have, then the following verb form will be in past participle form. Now, this is also true if we have not. Not is kind of vacuous. It's kind of invisible. It doesn't really contribute anything. The relationship between an auxiliary verb and the following verb form stays the same, even when we add not. So, for example, if we go back to the previous ones, okay, Michelle's friends have arrived. Now we notice that arrived looks like past tense, but it's not. It's in past participle form. When we add not, and we have auxiliary have, the same relationship applies between have and arrive. And so we should see have not arrived, same form as in the previous example. So again, not isn't really doing much here for the auxiliary and the verb that follows it. Those will stay the same. Same thing with auxiliary be. If I have be, the following verb form, whether or not I have not, is always going to be in present participle form. And we saw this over here. My aunt is coming to the barbecue, or my aunt is not coming to the barbecue. Notice coming just stays the same, that ing form, which is present participle. Now, when you have a modal auxiliary, which I didn't include in the previous example, what's going to follow it is going to be something in base or infinitival form. So, for example, if I say, you may not eat that, well, notice that eat is in a base or infinitival form. Similarly, if I say, you may eat that, eat stays the same base or infinitival form. Now, notice we're going to add an auxiliary here, and that is do. If you have do or do not, as sometimes you have to generate do to create a negative sentence, well, the following verb form is also going to be in the base or infinitival form. So let's go back to the previous example. I woke up early yesterday. Well, if I want to say the negative version of that sentence, I did not wake up early yesterday. Now, this is kind of interesting. You're going to notice that when you create a do, we don't say I did not woke up early yesterday. Rather, you're going to notice that this verb is in its base form or infinitival form. It's got no tense added to that. And the tense is actually over here on do. So we're going to revisit this sentence a little bit more. I'm going to ask you a couple more questions about this later. So here we see following do or do not, we're going to have a base or infinitival form of the verb. So we know that modals can be used with auxiliary have, as in I may have eaten that. They can also be used with be, I may be eating that, or both of those together, I may have been eating that. That's okay. But we can't use modal auxiliaries with do. And I want you to just pause the video for a minute and consider why not. Okay, so here are some examples. So I can say, I might have called my ex yesterday. That's unfortunate. But see, I've got my modal auxiliary, and I have, and that's okay. I can say, I may be getting a cold. That's okay, grammatically acceptable. But I cannot say, I might do not wake up early every day. That's ungrammatical. So the question is, why can't we use might, a modal, with do? Well, it kind of goes back to this idea that when you have a central verb or a core verb, you can add auxiliaries in this particular order. So starting from right to left, we don't start from right to left. I can have an auxiliary be before a verb. I can have an auxiliary have before a verb. And then I can have a modal auxiliary as kind of the last layer that I add. So I think of the verb like an onion, right? And these are all the different layers of the onion that we can add. Now, when we have to generate do, we assume that do is generated in the modal auxiliary spot. And therefore, that's why we can't have both do and a modal. There's already one auxiliary occupying that spot, and you can't have more than one. It would be like having two modals next to each other. I might should call my mom. Well, that's ungrammatical. So do itself is not a modal auxiliary. We will not label it as a modal auxiliary. We're going to label it as do. But nevertheless, it still sits in the slot as the same slot as modal auxiliaries when it is generated. Oops, sorry. There we go. Okay, so here's an example of a negative sentence with a modal auxiliary. Many millennials can't go 20 minutes without their phones. So in this case, many modal auxiliaries are going to use a contraction form Well, and that's actually true of actually all of the auxiliaries. They're most likely going to use a contraction form, especially in speech, like haven't, can't, shouldn't, these kinds of things. Won't, that's another one. So if we see something like this, can't, we're going to remember that's just a contraction of can and not. And when we label this on our trees, if we're doing our tree diagrams, we're going to actually separate can and not, and we're going to label them individually. And so I'm going to show you how to do that. I'm also going to post up a couple of pages you'll see for a few examples of trees with negatives. And you're going to note from those examples that you have like modal auxiliaries and be and have and do. If you have any of those things plus not, we're going to just bind them all up together as one auxiliary constituent. In class on Friday, I'll show you how to do that. You can also take a look at those trees, the pages that I post, and you can figure out how to do that as well too. So as one of our practice sentences, actually we have several of them that we've seen thus far, but one of the practice sentences is going to be a lot of students have not purchased health insurance. So if you want to try diagramming that sentence, take a few minutes to try to do that one, see how you do. Now let's look at main verb be. Remember that be is always kind of the exception to a lot of rules. And this is true when it comes to negative sentences. Now, the previous rule that we saw that I've had up here was to create a negative sentence, insert not after the first auxiliary verb in the sentence. Well, that rule does not apply to main verb be. Main verb be is different. So if you have main verb be and no other auxiliaries, then you're going to treat main verb be like it's an auxiliary verb. And you're going to place not after main verb be. That one doesn't follow the rules. So for example, if I said, he is mad, he's mad, notice the contraction form. We're going to break those two words up, he is, and we're going to diagram them separately. Now, if I want to make a negative version of that sentence, the negative version is going to be, he is not mad. He isn't mad. Now that's interesting, because again, if we were to follow our negative rule, we would note he is mad. Well, there's only one verb there, and that is the verb be, main verb be. And so I know by my auxiliary rule that if I only have a main verb and no other auxiliaries, I have to create do. So what that would normally get me is he does be mad, if I followed that rule. I had to create do. And then finally, I can put not after the first auxiliary, which is do. He does not be mad. So in theory, he does not be mad should be the sentence that we get if we're following our auxiliary rule that we saw back here, this auxiliary rule. Okay. But that's not what we see. He does not be mad is considered ungrammatical for many American English speakers. Now, this is kind of interesting, and this is something we're going to explore a lot. We're going to explore different uses of the verb be in a lot of different dialects of English. And depending on where you come from, he does not be mad could actually be a perfectly acceptable construction. Now, my mother's from the Caribbean. She's from Trinidad, in the Caribbean islands. And a sentence like this, he does not be mad, would be considered acceptable grammar. And this is kind of interesting because when she moved to the United States, she would say things like this, and people would say, oh, that's bad grammar. That's incorrect. But when you think about it, that is actually following the rule. Main verb be in this case is the exception to the rule, and everybody kind of has to learn that as they're growing up. So, and this is kind of analogous to what happens with children as they're acquiring a language, specifically English. Now, children do a process, what we call over-regularization. That is where they take a general rule and they kind of over-apply it to the exceptions. So they might say, he comed to the house yesterday. And an adult might correct them and say, he came to the house yesterday. That's correct. What you said was bad grammar, incorrect. But when you think about it, that child is actually applying the rule that they've learned, which is the regular rule of past tense to add ed onto any verb that they hear. And that makes it past tense, right? So they're overextending or over regularizing the rule into irregular verbs as well, too. Well, you might not be aware of this, but this actually happens with whole sentences and whole constructions as well. And this is where we get a lot of dialectal differences. You know, when we think back to prescriptive versus descriptive grammar, a lot of prescriptive grammarians might look at a sentence like this, he does not be mad, and to say that's bad grammar. It's incorrect. And completely disregard the fact that many dialects of English actually have this in the grammar as being correct. And in fact, it's more systematic than the exception to the rule, which is what we generally have to learn and have to follow. So I want you to keep that in mind, right? You know, things that are traditionally called bad grammar, they are systematic. And in fact, they can be more systematic than the target dialect's construction. Okay, so here's some more practice for practicing some negatives. We are going to have a lot of sentences, but many of them are very similar, so hopefully they won't take you too long. So we have, Megan's sister wasn't the first college graduate. Megan's sister wasn't graduating. 5 children didn't take the bus last week, and I may not have been listening. So go ahead and try to do these practice sentences on your own. Take a look at the pages I've posted as well, too. That'll help you to do the tree structures. And then hopefully when we get into class, we can just review them together. We won't really spend much time creating them. Okay, so that's it for negatives. Now, I want to talk a little bit about yes/no questions today. So a yes/no question is any question you can answer with either a yes or a no answer. Now, for example, if I say to you, have you eaten lunch? Your answer to me is either going to be yes or no. Or are you going to eat that? Yes or no. So that's a yes/no question. And again, I want to kind of backtrack a little bit. When we're doing negation and we're changing sentences to yes/no questions, we are starting to rearrange the core sentence structure that we've been practicing throughout all of our verbs and everything like that too. So we're going to start to do some movement here of constituents. So in order to change a statement into a yes/no question, the first thing you have to do is start with the statement. In other words, an assertion or indicative or declarative sentence. So we're going to start with the sentence, you have eaten lunch. This is just a statement. And then what we're going to do is we're going to move the first auxiliary verb that we see, and then we're going to move it to the front of the sentence. So in this case, there's only one auxiliary verb. If there were multiple auxiliary verbs, we just move the first one that we read. So you have eaten lunch. We're going to take have, and we're going to move that out of its spot into the front of, around the subject, around the whole subject. If it's a long subject, we're going to move around the whole subject. In this case, it's just you. And we get, have you eaten lunch? Same thing here. You are going to eat that. Now, to get this question, we need to take, wait a minute. We're going to take be. Now, this is auxiliary be, not main verb be. This is auxiliary be. So we're going to get, are you going to eat that? We're going to move the be to the front around the subject. So that gives us our yes/no questions. Now, as I said before, if you've got multiple auxiliaries, then you're going to move the first one. So, for example, he might have been eating that. I'm going to move might. Might he have been eating that? Okay. Sounds a little bit antiquated. Maybe there's an alternate construction or a different way to say that, but that is how we're going to actually move that. Or if I say, has he been eating that? The basic core sentence is going to be, he has been eating that. Okay. So I'm going to move has in this instance around the subject. Okay. So again, here we're going to have our rule at the top. Now, this one is for yes, no questions. The previous ones that we looked at, we had a rule at the top of the slide, and that was for the formation of negative sentences. So here's a rule we need to keep in mind. To create a yes, no question, move the first auxiliary of the main verb to the front of the sentence, around the subject. So if I have this question, are divorces becoming more common? What I need to do is actually take the auxiliary verb at the front of the sentence and move it back into its base position. That's how you're going to diagram it. You're going to diagram it in its base position first, and then you're going to show the movement of the auxiliary verb out of the sentence and around the subject. So we start with the assertion. Divorces are becoming more common. Now, what you're going to do is diagram that sentence. Divorces are becoming more common. Now, actually, I'm going to take out more in the practice sentences because we haven't talked about more yet. So in this case, what we're going to do, the next step is we're just going to move that auxiliary out, and we get are divorces becoming more common. Remember that auxiliary verbs always originate next to their main verb or another auxiliary verb. Okay, so they all like to stay together, and then it's only at the end that we move them, but they always originate next to the main verb. So now let's take a look at auxiliary do for a minute. Let's say, for example, I have the sentence, you called your ex at 3 o'clock this morning. Well, just like we saw with negatives, you're going to note that you do not have an auxiliary verb, and you need an auxiliary verb to make a negative statement or a question. Okay, so you're going to say, okay, I don't have an auxiliary verb. So now we're going to add a step. I need to create an auxiliary verb, and I generate do. You see, do is just kind of a placeholder, really. It's only generated just to satisfy the grammatical requirements of the sentence, but it's not really doing anything else otherwise. So we create do so that something, can carry tense. That's what's going on here. And we need to move something to the front of the sentence in order to create the question. So we have to create do for that reason. That's what the rules require. So we get, you did call your ex at 3 o'clock this morning. Now I want you to notice this. Notice where the tense is. Now it becomes did. And call changes to, if you remember correctly, the infinitival form. That's what we would expect. After auxiliary do, any verb after is going to be an infinitival form. And so there's no ed on the end. So we get, you did call your ex at 3 o'clock this morning. Rough night. So last step that we're going to do is we're going to move that first auxiliary to the front. Did you call your ex at 3 o'clock this morning? And there we got our question. So there's an extra step if you only have one verb and no auxiliaries. You have to create one. So the same thing that applies to negatives applies to yes, no questions. Okay. If you have auxiliary do, the following verb form in a yes, no question is going to be in base or infinitival form. And so again, I just want to reiterate this key point that we need to remember. An auxiliary verb is required to create negatives and questions. Okay, so now let's look at yes, no questions with main verb be. And once again, main verb be does not play by the rules. So let's say you have the assertion, you are hungry. Now, if we go by the previous rules that we looked at, you might notice, oh, hey, we have are and no other verb. So if I've got no other auxiliary verb, I got to create one. And I would create you do be hungry. And then I could add, I can move do to the front of the sentence, and I would end up with, do you be hungry? But that's not grammatically acceptable. Once again, I'll remind you that in some dialects, yes, this is absolutely grammatically acceptable because it plays by the rules. But in standard American English, the English that I'm speaking right now, main verb be does not play by the rules. It's an exception to the rule. And so we have to actually move main verb be to the front of the sentence. And that's what's considered grammatically acceptable. It's outside of the system. So we start, if we want to get the question, are you hungry? The first thing we got to do is actually move main verb be back to its original place. And you get, you are hungry. So this is, main verb be is the only main verb that moves, that raises. In all other instances, it's always going to be an auxiliary that moves, but never the main verb. So we get you are hungry on the first step with the assertion, and then we move that main verb be out to the front across the subject, and we get are you hungry? And that's going to be grammatically acceptable. So I'm going to post up another page with some yes/no question trees. You can take a look at that under week 11. Okay, so that's it. We're going to have a lot of sentences to review. Try to work on those as much as you can, and we'll hopefully get through them pretty quickly in class on Friday. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll see you all on Friday.